One night, my husband confessed after 10 years of marriage. I'm in love with your sister. We've been together for 2 years. Hi, welcome to my channel. Enjoy my new story.
After 10 years of marriage on a Wednesday evening in our own home, my husband didn't sit beside me as usual. He sat opposite me, looking straight into my eyes and saying, "I've loved your sister for 2 years now." He waited for me to fall apart, but I didn't answer, didn't respond. I simply stood up, silently picked up my phone and made a call. And in that very moment, he didn't know that things had begun to spiral out of control. Thank you for being here truly. Before this story starts, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from. Drop your city or country below, and let's see how far this reaches. Quick note, this story includes fictional elements for storytelling and educational value. Any similarity to names or locations is purely coincidental, but what you take away from it is anything but. There are moments in a marriage that split your life into a before and an after. Mine came on a Wednesday evening in April while the azaleas outside our Victorian were still in bloom and everything still looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. I'm sitting on the wraparound porch now long after midnight with a cup of coffee that went cold an hour ago. The street is quiet. Ardsley Park is always quiet at this hour, just the distant sound of a car turning somewhere on Washington Avenue, the occasional chorus of frogs from the drainage canal 2 blocks over, and the heavy, sweet scent of those azaleas coming in off the dark. Savannah at night has a way of making the world feel like it's holding its breath. That night in April, I understand now it was. My name is Sloan. For 10 years, I was Sloan Mercer, though I didn't know then what that name was costing me. I worked as a forensic accountant at the FBI field office here in Savannah, the kind of job where you spend your days tracing money that people tried very hard to make disappear. My husband Corbin was a neurosurgeon at Savannah Memorial Hospital. 12 years of medical school and residency, a reputation for steady hands and decisive thinking, a man colleagues called brilliant, and patients called a miracle. We had a 4-bedroom Victorian in one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in one of the most beautiful cities in America. We had Rafferty, who was 10, and already building things out of whatever he could find in the garage. We had Esme, who was 7, and had recently decided that the color green was the most important color in existence. We had Weston, our border collie, who right now was asleep in the corner of the living room and had no idea that the life he'd known was about to be reorganized entirely. From the outside, we were the family that seemed to have figured it out. I know because people told us so at dinner parties at school, pick up at the kind of neighborhood gatherings that Savannah does better than almost anywhere else in the South. You two make it look easy. That's what people said. I used to take it as a compliment. I know now that it's the kind of thing people say when they can't see what's underneath. The signs had been there for 18 months. I can say that clearly now with the particular clarity that only comes after the fact. At the time I did what most people do, I found explanations that fit the version of my life I wanted to keep. Corbin's phone always face down on the nightstand, always taken to the bathroom, always just a little too close to his hand. I told myself he was stressed about a difficult case. The late nights that stretched past 10, then 11, then midnight. Surgeries ran long. That was simply true, and I used that truth to cover for the times it wasn't. The growing distance, not dramatic, not the kind of distance you could point to, just a slow withdrawal, like a tide going out, so gradually you don't notice the water line has changed until you're standing on dry sand. I noticed. I just didn't let myself name it. That Wednesday, Corbin came home around 8. I was in the living room reviewing a file I'd brought home from the office. Weston lifted his head when the front door opened, then put it back down. Rafferty and Esme had been in bed for an hour. The house was quiet in the way that a house with children is only quiet after enormous effort. Corbin stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he sat down. Not next to me on the sofa the way he had every evening for 10 years. He sat in the armchair across from me. It was a small thing. It was the first thing my body understood before my mind caught up. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said it. "I'm in love with Ingrid. It's been 2 years. I'm telling you, because I can't keep hiding it." The room didn't change. That's the strange part that I still think about. The lamp was still on. Weston was still breathing in the corner. From somewhere upstairs, I heard Rafferty shift in his sleep, the old floorboards settling under the weight of a 10-year-old turning over in a dream. The air conditioner hummed its steady, indifferent note. Everything continued. The world did not pause to acknowledge what had just happened in that living room on a Wednesday night in April. Ingrid, my sister, the woman who had stood in my kitchen every Thanksgiving for a decade, who had held both of my children the day they came home from the hospital, who had looked me in the eye at Christmas dinner 6 weeks ago and told me she loved me. That Ingrid. 2 years. I set my coffee cup down on the side table. I looked at Corbin. Really looked at him, and I understood something that I hadn't expected to understand in that moment. I did not know this man. Not the version sitting across from me with his careful prepared words and his relieved expression, the expression of someone who has finally put down a weight they were tired of carrying. I had known a version of him. This was not that version. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. What happened instead was a kind of stillness that I recognize now as the particular stillness of someone whose professional training has just quietly and without announcement taken over. "Thank you for telling me," I said. My voice was level. I stood up, walked to the front closet, and took my jacket off the hook by the door. Corbin said something. I don't remember what. I was already thinking about the phone in my hand, about the one call I needed to make before I did anything else. Not to Ingrid, not to my mother, Henrietta, who would have picked up on the second ring and who I loved too much to put through what I was about to put myself through. Not to Saoirse, my closest friend, who would have arrived within 20 minutes with wine and the best of intentions and a warmth I couldn't afford to feel yet. There was one call to make, one person who would ask exactly the right question. The call I made that night was the first move in a game Corbin had no idea we were playing. 20 minutes later, I was driving south on Abercorn Street, the Spanish moss hanging low over the road like curtains drawn against the rest of the world. I drove the way people drive when their hands know the route and their mind is somewhere else, entirely past the squares, past the darkened storefronts. Past the old houses with their gas lanterns still burning at this hour, their amber light catching the moss and turning it gold. Savannah is a city that looks like a painting at night. That Wednesday, I drove through it without seeing any of it. Theodora Vance lived in a narrow 3-story townhouse on Jones Street, one of those beautifully preserved blocks in the historic district where the brick sidewalks are so old they've settled into gentle waves beneath your feet. She'd been my closest friend for 11 years and a family law attorney for 14. Those two facts had always existed separately in my mind, the friend and the lawyer, two different people who happened to share the same face. That night, for the first time, I needed them to be the same person. She opened the door before I knocked. She took one look at my face and did not say a single word about how I was feeling. That more than anything told me I had called the right person. Her kitchen was warm and narrow with tall ceilings and a window that looked out onto a small walled garden. She sat me down at the table, put the kettle on, and poured 2 cups of chamomile without asking if I wanted any. Then she sat down across from me, opened the legal pad she'd already placed on the table, and asked the question that would pull me back from the edge of wherever I was drifting. "Do you have a joint account?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I can't believe he did this." Not, "What are you going to do?" She asked about the account. And that question, so specific, so practical, so completely unbothered by the emotional wreckage sitting in her kitchen chair, did more to bring me back to myself than anything else could have. "Yes," I said, "checking and savings, and a brokerage account at Charles Schwab." "Who manages the Schwab account?" I paused. "Corbin does. He gives me quarterly summaries." Theodora wrote something on her legal pad and didn't look up. I understood then that the pause I'd just taken, that half-second of recognition, was the kind of pause that changes things. I told her everything. From the beginning, the way I would write a forensic report, chronological, factual, without editorializing. Corbin's confession, the exact words he used. The way he'd sat across from me instead of next to me. Ingrid, 2 years. I watched Theodora write and did not allow myself to feel anything that would get in the way of the telling. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me to describe my relationship with Ingrid. I thought about my sister, the way you think about someone you've known so long they've become part of your internal landscape, not a person, so much as a fixture, something you stop seeing clearly because it's always been there. Ingrid was 34 to my 38, an interior designer based out of Charleston, an hour and a half down the coast, divorced 2 years ago after a marriage that had never quite settled into itself. She called often. She showed up at holidays and stayed a day longer than planned and had opinions about my furniture and my kitchen renovation and the way I was handling Rafferty's reading trouble in second grade. She had always wanted things. That was the kindest way I knew to say it. There was a restlessness in Ingrid that I had spent years treating as something to be managed rather than examined. And once about 3 years back at a birthday dinner I'd thrown for her at our house in Ardsley Park, she'd looked around the table at Corbin at the kids, at the Victorian with its high ceilings and original plasterwork, and she'd said very quietly, almost to herself, "You always had everything I ever wanted slow." I had laughed it off. I'd assumed she meant the house or the life or simply the stability that had always come more easily to me than to her. Standing in Theodora's kitchen at midnight, I understood that I had assumed wrong. Theodora pushed the legal pad across the table. She had written 3 words in capital letters underlined twice. Document. Everything. First. Don't touch the Schwab account, she said. Don't move anything. Don't call Ingrid. Don't tell Corbin you've spoken to anyone. She leaned forward slightly. You're a forensic accountant, Sloan. You know exactly what a paper trail looks like, how it's built, how it's destroyed, how it's found. Now you're going to build one of your own. Something shifted in my chest when she said that. Not comfort exactly, more like a compass needle finding north after spinning for hours. We sat in that kitchen until nearly 1 a.m. By the time Theodora walked me to the door, I had 3 columns filled on a fresh legal pad of my own, assets, risks, actions required. My handwriting was steady. My hands had stopped shaking sometime around midnight, and I hadn't noticed until just then. The drive home was quiet. I took Abercorn back north, retracing the same route I'd driven in the other direction an hour before through the same moss-draped squares, past the same amber lanterns. But I was not the same person who had driven south. I thought about the Charles Schwab account. Corbin had mentioned the balance at a dinner party 18 months ago, $527,000. Said with the easy confidence of a man who manages his family's finances well and knows it. He had seemed proud. I had been proud of him. Tomorrow morning, I was going to log in for the first time and find out what that number actually was. I waited until Corbin's car turned off the street and disappeared around the corner. Then I made a cup of coffee I wouldn't drink, sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, and logged into Charles Schwab for the first time in 10 years of marriage. The morning was already warm the way Savannah mornings get in April, thick and golden, the kind of light that comes through old windows in slanted bars and makes everything look softer than it is. Rafferty and Esme had left for school 40 minutes earlier, backpacks bouncing, Esme still arguing that her green sneakers were the correct choice for picture day. The house was quiet. Weston had settled under the kitchen table near my feet. The only sound was the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and the faint mechanical hum of a city waking up outside. The login screen loaded. I typed the credentials from the shared document Corbin had set up years ago, the one stored in our joint household folder, under a name so ordinary I had scrolled past it 100 times without opening it. The account loaded. Current balance $187,000. I sat very still for 3 full minutes. I know it was 3 minutes because I watched the clock on the microwave above the stove, the green digits ticking over once, twice, 3 times. While I looked at the number on the screen and let my brain do what it was trained to do, not react, not interpret, not feel, just receive. 18 months ago, at a dinner party at the Hendersons' house over on East 49th Street, Corbin had mentioned our investment balance with the easy pride of a man who manages his family's finances well and enjoys the fact. $527,000. He'd set it between the salad course and the main, like someone casually setting a trophy on the table. I remembered the way he smiled when one of our friends whistled low under his breath. I remembered thinking at the time that I loved the way he carried that pride quietly without performance, like a man who had built something worth keeping. The current balance was $187,000. $340,000 was gone. I opened a new tab and pulled up 18 months of transaction history. This is the part that most people in my situation would not know how to read. I am not most people. I've spent 11 years at the FBI field office in Savannah, doing exactly this, sitting with financial records and finding the story that someone tried to bury inside the numbers. I know what legitimate market losses look like. I know what unauthorized transfers look like. I know the precise difference between an account that declined and an account that was deliberately drained. This account had been drained. The transfers were not large. That was the first thing I noticed, and it told me something important about whoever had designed this. Small figures ranging from $4,000 to $9,000 made at irregular intervals, spaced just far enough apart to avoid triggering the automatic monitoring thresholds that most financial institutions apply under federal reporting requirements. No single transaction would have raised a flag. No single transaction would have caught my attention on a casual monthly review had I ever been invited to conduct one. Taken together across 18 months of careful, patient movement, they added up to $340,000, leaving an account that Corbin had told me at a dinner table, with a smile I had believed was growing. This was not the work of someone who didn't understand financial systems. This was the work of someone who understood them well enough to move around them without leaving obvious footprints. I downloaded everything. Every statement, every transaction record, every confirmation number, 47 pages in total. Then I called Theodora. She picked up on the second ring. I read her the numbers without preamble. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Get a USB drive today. Pay cash, not a card. Go to the FedEx office on Bull Street and print everything there. Not your home printer. Not anything at the office. A brief pause. Do you understand why? I understood completely. A home printer logs every document it processes. A work printer at a federal agency maintains even more detailed records accessible to a wider chain of oversight. I needed the paper trail I was building to exist only in places I controlled, attached to nothing that could be queried or subpoenaed before I was ready. I drove to the FedEx office on Bull Street that afternoon, paid $11 in cash, stood at the self-service station and printed 47 pages, then slid them into a plain manila folder from the supply rack near the door. The entire transaction took under 20 minutes and left no record connected to my name. Back home, I placed the folder behind the binders in my home office cabinet, the ones labeled with federal case reference numbers, the shelf where Corbin had never once looked in 10 years of living inside the same house. Then I sat back down at my desk and stayed with the pattern I had found in those transfers. $340,000 moved in careful, calibrated increments. The precision of it troubled me more than the amount itself. Corbin was brilliant. No one who had watched him work in an operating room would question that. But this kind of financial architecture required a different category of knowledge. Someone had either taught him how to structure this, or someone had structured it alongside him. That distinction mattered. It would matter more later. I was still holding that thought when my phone rang at 4:15. Theodora. Her voice was different from the one she'd used that morning, slower, more deliberate. The register she kept for moments when she needed me to stay composed before she delivered something I was not going to want to hear. Sloan. A pause that had weight in it. I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning. There's something you need to see in person. Another pause, shorter. Sit down before I say this. I found where the money went. I sat down. And it's worse than we thought, she said. I looked at the ceiling fan turning slowly above the kitchen table. I thought about the green digits on the microwave clock. I thought about a dinner party on East 49th Street and a man who had smiled like someone with nothing to hide. I'll be there at 8, I said. The next morning, I drove to Theodora's office on Drayton Street through the oldest part of Savannah, past the squares and the live oaks. past the iron fences and the morning glories climbing the garden walls of houses that had been standing since before the Civil War. It was a beautiful drive. It always was. That morning I barely saw it. I was carrying the particular dread of someone who already knows the news is bad and is walking toward it anyway, because the only thing worse than knowing is not knowing. Theodora's office occupied the second floor of a restored building 2 blocks from Chippewa Square. The waiting room was small and well-appointed, the kind of space that communicated quiet competence without trying too hard. Her assistant waved me through without a word. Theodora was already at her conference table when I walked in. A series of documents laid out in front of her with the careful arrangement of someone who has been organizing her thoughts since before sunrise. She did not offer coffee. She did not ask how I'd slept. She pulled out the chair across from her and waited for me to sit down. Then she began. The first document was a Delaware LLC registration filed in February of 2023. The company name was Callaway Design Partners. The registered agent and sole member was listed as Ingrid Callaway. I looked at the name for a long moment. Callaway was my maiden name. Ingrid had kept it after her divorce. She had built a company with it, a company I had never heard of, never been told about, never been given any reason to know existed. Where did the money go? I asked, though I already understood the shape of the answer. Theodora set the second document beside the first 18 months of wire transfer records, each one moving a sum between $4,000 and $9,000 from the Charles Schwab account into a business checking account held by Callaway Design Partners. The transfers began in November of 2022, 2 months after the LLC was incorporated. They continued regular as a pulse until 6 weeks ago. $340,000 moved in careful increments over 18 months into a company that bore my family's name and had been built apparently to receive it. The transfer pattern I'd analyzed the previous morning made sense now in a way it hadn't before. The careful sizing, the irregular timing, the amounts deliberately kept below federal reporting thresholds. This wasn't Corbin's architecture. Corbin was a surgeon. His precision was spatial muscular, the kind earned in operating rooms over decades of practice. This was a different kind of precision entirely. Someone who understood financial structures had designed this. Ingrid had been running an interior design business for 8 years. She understood invoicing, business accounts, cash flow management. She had known exactly how to build a receiving mechanism for money that wasn't hers. I thought I had already absorbed the full weight of what had been done to me. I had been wrong. Theodora was not finished. She placed a third document on the table, a loan agreement, second mortgage on the property at our Ardsley Park address, dated October 2023. Principal amount $180,000. Single signatory. The house is in both your names, I said. Joint tenancy. The bank would have required both signatures. Correct, Theodora said. And here is how he got around that. The fourth document was a copy of a power of attorney I had signed in the spring of 2020. I recognized it immediately. I had been assigned to a federal task force in Washington, D.C. that year, a long-term assignment, 4 months. The kind of extended absence that creates real practical problems when you own property and share finances with another person. Corbin had suggested the POA as a sensible precaution. Our estate attorney at the time had drawn it up. I had signed it without hesitation because he was my husband, and because trusting him with the management of our shared life while I was away was not a decision I had thought twice about. The document was a durable power of attorney, which means it carried full legal force regardless of circumstance, and did not expire unless explicitly revoked. It authorized Corbin to act on my behalf in all financial and real property matters. It was notarized, properly filed, entirely legitimate. He had used it 3.5 years after I signed it to place a second mortgage on our home without telling me. The bank had accepted it because they were legally required to. A validly executed durable POA is as binding as a personal signature under Georgia law. The loan officer had processed the paperwork the same way they would process any other transaction correctly by the book, with no way of knowing that the woman whose name was on the deed had no idea any of this was happening. I sat with that for a moment. The total number arranged itself in my mind without my having to calculate it. $340,000 from Schwab, $180,000 from the mortgage, $520,000 removed from our shared financial life through a combination of patience planning and the trust I had extended freely over 10 years of marriage. I thought about every time Corbin had said it, and he had said it often at dinner tables and in passing conversations, and once in front of my own mother, "I handle the finances. You focus on your work." I had taken it as consideration, as partnership, as the natural division of labor between two busy people who trusted each other. It had been the mechanism of my own undoing. "This isn't just an infidelity case anymore," Theodora said. Her voice was measured but firm, the voice she used when she needed a client to understand something fully rather than emotionally. POA abuse in Georgia is a criminal offense under state financial exploitation statutes. Corbin isn't only facing a divorce proceeding, he's facing potential criminal exposure. That changes everything about how we approach this. I looked out the window. Across the rooftops of the historic district, the twin spires of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist rose against the April sky, pale stone against pale blue. The same view that had been there for over 150 years and would be there long after whatever happened next. I thought about the wraparound porch, the azalea garden that Rafferty had helped me plant 2 springs ago, the two of us in rubber boots in the February mud. Him asking questions about root depth with the focused seriousness of a boy who wanted to understand how growing things worked. Esme's room still the wrong shade of green because she had changed her mind 3 times, and we hadn't repainted yet, and I had been meaning to, and now. They were not getting that house. Whatever it cost, whatever it required, whatever the next weeks and months were going to demand of me, that house was not part of the settlement I was prepared to make. But before I could fight for it, I had to go home and make dinner and help with homework and be present for 2 children who had no idea that everything they knew was about to be reorganized. I had to walk back through the door of the house and inhabit it normally for as long as it took. That was the harder task. And it started today. It takes a very particular skill to sit across the breakfast table from the man who stole your future and still smile when you pour his coffee. I discovered that skill at the end of April that year. I'd been training for it my entire marriage without ever knowing it. Saturday morning came the way Savannah mornings always did in late April, slow and golden, the light pressing through the kitchen curtains like it had nowhere urgent to be. The jasmine outside the bay window had opened overnight, and the whole room smelled like something that used to make me happy. I made French toast. I set the table. I folded the napkins. I pressed the heel of my hand against the countertop for exactly 4 seconds before I turned around, spatula in hand, and said, "Good morning," to the man sitting at the head of it. Corbin looked up from his phone. He set it face down. Old habit. New meaning. "Morning," he said. There was something careful in his voice, the way a man speaks when he's rehearsing his own innocence. He watched me move from counter to stove to table with the particular attention of someone waiting to be caught. "I know," I thought. "And you don't know that I know how much there is to know." I poured his coffee. I smiled. Rafferty came downstairs at 7:43, still in his soccer jersey, hair flattened on one side. He dropped into his chair and reached for the orange juice without looking up, then stopped. He looked at me, then at his father, then back at me. 10 years old and already reading rooms like a detective. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I touched the back of his head, smoothed his hair down. "Of course, baby. Eat before it gets cold." He ate, but he didn't stop watching us. That was the part they never tell you about the children, how they become these small, silent seismographs, registering every tremor you swear you've hidden. Rafferty didn't ask again. He just ate his French toast with the careful focus of a boy who had decided on some wordless level to pay attention. I loved him so much in that moment, it felt like a bruise. Monday, I was back at my desk by 7:15. The FBI Savannah field office on Bull Street runs quiet in the mornings, the kind of institutional quiet that smells like burnt coffee and recycled air, where the fluorescent lights hum at a frequency just below consciousness. I had spent 9 years finding that hum comforting, a clean sound, a purposeful one. I sat down, opened my case files, and began to work. This is what you do, I told myself. You work. You document. You do not let him see you bleed. I was halfway through a procurement audit when Isadora appeared at the edge of my cubicle, coffee in one hand, a printed email in the other. Got a minute? Isadora Vance had been my office neighbor for 4 years, meticulous, dry-humored, the kind of woman who noticed things without ever appearing to look. She set the printout on my desk face down, then flipped it over. This came through the general intake box this morning, flagged by the system for the threat keyword list. She kept her voice low, conversational. It references you by name. I read it. The email was unsigned. The language was oblique, careful, like someone who understood exactly how far they could go without crossing a legal threshold. It referenced a personal matter involving my professional conduct. It implied that certain private information about my background might become relevant to parties who had an interest in my current case assignments. My hand did not shake. I was proud of that. Internal protocol requires a report to the SSA before end of business, Isadora said, watching me. Even if it's nothing, especially if it seems like nothing. I know the protocol. I know you know. She paused. I'm saying it out loud anyway. I looked up at her. There was something in her expression, not pity exactly, but the particular steadiness of someone who has decided to stand near you without being asked why. Thank you, I said. She nodded, took her coffee, and walked back to her desk. I filed the report at 4:52 p.m. Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Webb received it, acknowledged it, and opened a preliminary log. I watched him initial the form from across the bullpen. Procedure. Clean. Documented. Everything Theodora had written. Document everything first. That evening, Corbin called at 6 to say he'd be late, a post-operative complication, he said. His voice had the right texture of tired. Professional tired, not guilty. Tired. I used to not know the difference. I made dinner for Rafferty and Esme helped with homework, gave baths, read 2 chapters of Charlotte's Web in a voice that didn't waver. After they were asleep, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment doing nothing. Then I noticed it. It was faint, barely there, layered under Corbin's jacket, hanging on the hall hook. A perfume I almost recognized, not mine. Something warmer, woodsier. The kind of scent that doesn't come from a department store counter. I'd smelled it before. I couldn't place it yet, but the part of my brain that had spent 9 years tracing money through shell companies and numbered accounts had already taken a photograph. It would find the match. Later, lying in bed with Weston's weight against my feet and the ceiling fan turning slow overhead, I thought about what Rafferty had said at breakfast. Is everything okay? Not yet, I thought. But it will be. I was already 3 moves ahead. Corbin just didn't know the game had started. In my line of work, the best evidence is rarely the evidence you actively seek. It's the evidence that surfaces when you least expect it, usually because the people hiding something have stopped being careful. I came home through the back. The garage door was open, which was the first thing wrong. Corbin had texted me at noon board meeting runs late, don't wait on dinner, and his car was supposed to be in the Savannah Memorial parking structure until at least 7. But there it was, his silver Audi sitting in the third bay engine, cold windshield clean. I stood in the doorway between the garage and the mudroom, and I waited. Something in the back of my skull went very still, the same stillness that comes over me when a number in a ledger doesn't reconcile. Not alarm, not panic. Just the quiet, total attention of a woman whose job it is to notice discrepancies. The house smelled like jasmine from the open kitchen window, and underneath it, something warmer, something woodsier. I knew that perfume now. I set my keys on the mudroom bench without making a sound and moved through the kitchen in my socks. The voices came from the home office down the hall. Not the television, I knew the difference by now, the particular texture of 2 people speaking low in a room they believed was empty. A murmur, a pause, a murmur again. The rhythm of a conversation that has been had many times before in many rooms in a house that belongs to someone else. I stopped at the hallway entrance. Through the half-open door, I could see the edge of my own desk, the one I'd had shipped from our old apartment in Chicago when we moved to Savannah, the one with the scratched lower left corner from when Rafferty was 4 and drove a toy truck along its edge. Ingrid was sitting on it, not in a chair. On the desk itself, one ankle crossed over the other like she'd always had a right to be there. Corbin stood near the window with his arms folded close enough that the space between them read like a habit. I pushed the door open. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of surprise, though surprise was there. It was the silence of confirmation. The silence that happens when a secret that has been carefully held in 2 pairs of hands is suddenly without ceremony dropped. Ingrid looked at me first. For a half second, her face did something unguarded, a flash of something genuine, something that might have been shame if it hadn't been so quickly swallowed. Then her chin came up and she started to speak. "It's Sloane," I said before she could finish. My voice came out even, steady, like I was correcting a clerical error. "And you need to leave." The name she'd used, that old name, the one from childhood, from summers at our grandmother's house in Beaufort, from phone calls and Christmas mornings, and every time she needed something from me, she'd reached for it like a key that used to fit. She was still calculating. I could see it behind her eyes, even then, even in that moment, the pivot, the next angle. Ingrid had never in her life been in a room without knowing the exits. She slid off the desk, picked up her bag, walked past me in the doorway close enough that I could smell it clearly, now the same warm, woody perfume I'd cataloged 3 days ago on Corbin's jacket. She didn't touch me. She didn't say anything else. But before she stepped into the hallway, she glanced back once, not at Corbin, at me. It was the look of a woman already deciding what comes next. Corbin's voice found me before the front door had finished closing. It wasn't what... I know exactly what it was. I set my keys on the kitchen counter, a small, deliberate sound. "I've known for a while now." He stopped. Something shifted in his face, the prepared speech deflating the careful construction of his innocence, suddenly unsupported. He opened his mouth again, and I turned and walked upstairs before he could find the words. I locked the bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I did not cry. Crying requires a certain luxury of feeling the belief that the feeling is the only important thing in the room. I couldn't afford that anymore. I had 2 hours. Rafferty and Esme were at his mother's house in Pooler due back at 6. That was 2 hours for the bedroom ceiling to stop moving. 2 hours to let the architecture of everything I'd built with this man settle into whatever shape it was going to take from here on out. 2 hours before I had to walk downstairs and be Mom, the version of me that cuts apple slices and asks about soccer practice and reads chapter books in a steady voice that doesn't shake. I listened to Corbin move through the house below me, his footsteps in the hallway, a long pause outside my door, then the stairs, then the front door, then the sound of his car backing down the driveway and disappearing into the low hum of a Savannah Saturday. I took out my phone. I typed one word to Theodora, confirmed. Her response came in under 30 seconds. "Good. Don't say anything tonight. We file Wednesday." I set the phone face up on the nightstand and lay back against the headboard. At the top of the stairs, Weston's nails clicked softly across the hardwood. He paused outside my door, turned once, and lay down against it. 3 pounds of border collie confidence that someone he loved was on the other side. I closed my eyes. 2 hours, I thought. Be their mother for 2 hours. And then when they're asleep, be the woman who is going to win this. I had already confirmed what I needed. The rest was paperwork. And paperwork I knew how to do. 2 weeks after that Wednesday night in April, on a quiet Wednesday morning in early May, while Corbin was 6 hours into a neurosurgery at Savannah Memorial and Rafferty and Esme were at school, Theodora Vance filed our divorce petition at the Chatham County Courthouse. Her office on Drayton Street was different in the morning light, softer somehow the way Savannah always looks before the heat sets in and the air turns heavy and still. She had the documents laid out on the conference table when I arrived, 3 sets tabbed and aligned. the kind of precision that comes from someone who has done this enough times to know that chaos lives in the margins, and that the margins are where cases are lost. She handed me a pen, not a standard office pen, something heavier. Lacquered black with a gold nib, the kind you don't use to sign grocery receipts or school permission slips. Not to celebrate, she said before I could ask. To begin. I signed my name in 4 places. Sloan Mercer Whitfield, each letter deliberate, each signature identical to the last. The pen moved without hesitation. I had made this decision 16 days ago in the dark of my own bedroom with Weston sleeping against the door, and I had not unmade it once in the 2 weeks since. Not in the shower at 6 a.m., not at the school pickup line, not at 2 in the morning when the house went completely quiet and there was nothing between me and the decision except the ceiling. Theodora filed digitally at 9:47 a.m., then dispatched a courier to the courthouse for the physical copy. The process server was scheduled for 2 p.m. timed precisely for the gap between Corbin's surgery and his post-op rounds, when he would be in the attending lounge still wearing scrubs. Phone finally in hand, coming down off the particular high of a successful procedure. That was the version of Corbin who believed the world was cooperating with him. That was the version I wanted, holding the envelope. I thought about that timing the whole drive home. He'll be at his most himself when it happens, I thought. And then he won't be. The call started at 2:15. I was at my desk in the FBI field office working through a procurement audit that had nothing to do with my life when the first one came through. I watched the screen light up. Corbin. I set the phone face down on the desk and kept working. The spreadsheet on my monitor held 63 line items. I reviewed everyone. 222, 231, 249, 345. 5 calls across 90 minutes each one, routed to voicemail each moment after the screen went dark, a small and deliberate decision. I was not avoiding him out of fear. I was avoiding him because I had nothing to say that would serve me, and Theodora had been precise on that point. Let the document speak first. Your voice comes later and only through me. I finished the audit. I sent it to my supervisor. I drove home at 5:30 through the moss-draped streets of Ardsley Park and thought about nothing except the road. He came home at 7. The kitchen light was on and warm. Esme was upstairs working through a reading assignment, and Rafferty was at the kitchen table with a long division worksheet and the specific scowl of a child who has decided that mathematics is a personal adversary. I was standing at the stove when I heard the garage door groan open. Corbin walked in, pale. Not the pale of illness or exhaustion, the pale of a man whose internal architecture has just been stress-tested in a way he did not anticipate. He set his keys on the granite counter, looked at the children, looked at me, and said in a voice working very hard to stay controlled, "Can we talk?" Rafferty looked up from his worksheet. "Later," I said, meaning not in front of them, not ever in front of them. We moved to the back hallway where the sound didn't carry. His voice dropped and tightened simultaneously, the sound of a man trying to compress something large into something manageable. "You went to a lawyer without even talking to me first." I had prepared for many versions of this conversation during the 16 days of waiting. The guilty version, where he broke down and confessed everything he thought I didn't already know. The deflecting version, where he reframed the transfers as a misunderstanding. The begging version, which I had thought most likely. I had not anticipated the indignant version, the voice of a man who considered himself genuinely wronged by the consequences of his own decisions. The audacity of it was almost architectural in its construction. I kept my voice level and even. "You had a 2-year affair with my sister." I said it the way I would state a finding in a forensic report, plainly without inflection, as a fact that required no emotional scaffolding. "You transferred $340,000 out of our joint Schwab brokerage account through a Shell LLC registered in her name. And you used a durable power of attorney one I gave you in good faith when I was traveling for work to place a $180,000 second mortgage on this house without my knowledge or my signature." I let one beat of silence pass. "What exactly did you think we still needed to discuss?" He opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. I turned back to the kitchen and finished making dinner. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer, then disappeared upstairs. He did not come back down to eat. He was gone by 9. I didn't ask where. I already knew the family location sharing was still active on his phone when he backed out of the driveway, and I watched the blue dot move steadily south on the map for 41 minutes before it settled in Charleston. He disabled location sharing at 10:13 p.m. By that point, I had already screenshotted the route, noted the timestamp, and saved both to the Q3 folder on my secure drive. Charleston, I thought, and set my phone on the nightstand. I messaged Theodora. She replied within minutes. Drummond Hayes filed his appearance this afternoon. Aggressive hire, former federal prosecutor. It means they're scared and they need time to rearrange things. I looked up Drummond Hayes. 12 years in Savannah private practice following a federal career. Known for delay tactics and discovery attrition, the kind of attorney retained when a client has significant assets to protect and needs the opposing side to run out of patience before the full picture emerges. The strategy was recognizable. I had seen similar patterns in financial fraud cases create enough procedural noise that the truth gets buried under the volume of the response. Let them rearrange, I thought. I already have the receipts. 3 days after we filed, an email arrived from a throwaway address, a random alphanumeric string, the kind generated in under a minute at any public terminal. The message was exactly 3 sentences. You think you're the smart one. You always have. Let's see how smart you are when everyone finds out who you really are. I read it twice. The threat was calibrated, vague enough to be legally deniable, specific enough in its intent to be unmistakable. Someone who understood the threshold, someone with guidance or experience or both. I forwarded it immediately to Theodora. Then I saved it with a full timestamp to the secure folder on my drive labeled Regulatory Updates Q3. In 11 years of forensic accounting work, I had learned one principle above all others. The first mistake is always the most expensive. It announces the pattern. It tells you how frightened someone is and what they're willing to risk. They had just made theirs. That night at 9 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Rafferty appeared on the landing in his soccer jersey, face soft with something he didn't yet have language for. He was 10 years old, and he was already carrying the particular weight of a child who senses the adults around him are managing something carefully. Is Dad not coming home tonight? I turned off the hallway light and climbed the stairs and sat down beside him on the step. The wood creaked beneath us. Down the hall, the faint orange glow of Esme's nightlight pressed through the gap under her door. I put my arm around his shoulders. He leaned his head against mine without a word. We sat there for a while. Neither of us spoke. The hardest moment in any of this was not the day I discovered the wire transfers. It was not signing the petition with the lacquered pen. It was not watching Corbin's face when the documents landed. It was this: a boy on the stairs in a soccer jersey. A question I could not answer yet. A silence I filled the only way I knew how, by staying in it with him, without moving, without looking away. I've spent enough years working federal investigations to know what people reach for when they're desperate. They reach for the nearest weapon. For Corbin and Drummond, that weapon was my career. It was the worst choice they could have made. The email arrived on a Saturday morning. I was at my kitchen table with coffee and a case file when my personal phone buzzed the same throwaway account address from 3 days prior, the same deliberate vagueness dressed up as menace. This time the message had a shape to it. The FBI case you handled in 2021, the Meridian procurement audit, had irregularities you never reported. We have documentation. Continue this divorce proceeding and we release it to 3 media contacts by end of week. 3 sentences, no signature. The grammar of someone who had thought about this carefully or had been coached by someone who had. I read it once. Then I forwarded it to Theodora, set my personal phone face down, and picked up my bureau-issued device. By 9 a.m., I was at the field office. Isadora was already at her desk when I walked in. She looked up, read my face in the way she had of reading faces, and said nothing. I went directly to SSA Marcus Webb's office and knocked twice. I need to file a formal report, I said. Threat communication targeting an active federal employee in connection with ongoing civil litigation. He waved me to the chair across from his desk. I sat. I laid out the timeline in the order I would present it to a grand jury, the first email 3 days prior, the internal report already on file, and now this, a direct threat to leak fabricated information about a closed bureau case unless I withdrew from legally filed divorce proceedings. Webb listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You know what this is? Obstruction, possibly witness tampering, definitely a federal matter." He nodded. "I'll open it under the threat assessment protocol. You don't touch the trace." "I know." I stood. "I'm just the complainant here." The Internal Security Division ran the IP trace through a federal search warrant issued the following Tuesday. I was not in the room when they executed it. I was at my desk working the way I had been working every day for the past 2 weeks, steadily, deliberately, one verified fact at a time. Isadora stopped by my cubicle at 3:47 p.m. "Webb wants to see you," she said. Her voice was carefully neutral, which told me everything. The trace had resolved to a device registered to the administrative network of Drummond Hayes and Associates, 104 East Liberty Street, Savannah, Georgia. Not a personal device, a firm device. The kind of digital footprint left by someone who understood how to threaten people, but had underestimated what happens when the person you threaten works in a building that traces things for a living. Webb walked me through the findings in 4 minutes. I thanked him, returned to my desk, and called Theodora from the parking garage. "They didn't just threaten me," I said when she picked up. "They threatened a federal officer in the middle of active civil litigation." A beat of silence. "That's not a divorce matter anymore," she said. "That's a completely different category of misconduct." "I know. I want you to hold the documentation. Don't file it yet. Let it sit. As leverage." "As pressure," I said. "There's a difference. Leverage implies a trade. Pressure just means they have to keep wondering when it lands." She was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before." "I trace money for the federal government," I said. "Yes, I have." 2 days later, Theodora's investigative team surfaced something that reframed everything I thought I already understood. She called me at 6 p.m. and asked if I was sitting down. I was standing in my kitchen watching the back garden through the window, and I did not sit down. In November of 2023, Corbin had submitted a formal application to Austin Medical Center's neurosurgery division. In December the same month, he'd been shopping with me for a new living room rug. He had placed a deposit on a 2-bedroom apartment in the Rainy Street neighborhood of Austin, Texas. The lease listed 2 tenants, Corbin Whitfield, Ingrid Calloway. I stood very still for a moment. Theodora kept talking start date of March 2024, 6-month lease with renewal option utilities in Ingrid's name. I heard all of it. I was also doing math. I had returned from my Chicago conference assignment 3 weeks earlier than originally scheduled. My original return date had been April 14th. I came back April 21st, no April the 3rd. I had reshuffled my schedule because of a witness deposition that moved forward. 3 weeks. If I had come back on the date, Corbin expected the accounts would have been drained, the second mortgage quietly refinanced or abandoned, and I would have come home to a husband who was already packed. I had not discovered anything. I had simply arrived before he finished leaving. "Sloan," Theodora said. "I'm here." My voice was steady. "Add the lease to Exhibit C." I set the phone down on the counter. This had never been an affair. Affairs were messy, impulsive, driven by want and proximity. This had been a plan drafted in November, funded through the summer, given a zip code and a move-in date, and a co-tenant. I had not been betrayed by weakness. I had been removed from a plan like an inconvenient variable. The professional part of my brain, the part that spent its days following money to find intent, recognized the architecture immediately. The rest of me took a moment longer. My phone buzzed at 7:15. Ingrid Calloway. I watched the screen pulse once, twice, 3 times, then go dark. A minute later again, then a 3rd time. Then a text, "Please. I just need 5 minutes." I turned the screen face down on the counter and started making dinner. 5 minutes would get her nothing she wanted and cost me something I couldn't afford, the clean, documented distance between what I knew and what she thought I was willing to say out loud. Ingrid had always mistaken silence for weakness. She would learn otherwise. She came on a Sunday evening 1 week after we filed while Rafferty and Esme were upstairs doing homework. She had clearly thought about what to wear. She looked remorseful. She had rehearsed the remorse. Those two things are not the same. I saw her car before I saw her, a slate gray Volvo parked one house down, which meant she'd thought about that too. Not directly in front. Close enough to walk far enough to suggest she wasn't certain she'd be welcome. She was right about that. When the doorbell rang, I took a breath and opened the door. I did not step back to let her in. I stood in the frame with one hand on the door and waited. Ingrid looked the way she always looked when she needed something. From someone careful, softened the sharp edges of her personality turned inward until the right moment. She was wearing the gray linen dress again. By now I knew exactly what it meant when she wore it. Her hair was down. She had not worn jewelry, which I recognized as a choice. Less armor means less threat. And Ingrid understood costuming, the way she understood everything else as a tool. "Hi," she said. I said nothing. She started with Beaufort. Our grandmother's house, the summers we spent there as children. The way we used to sleep in the same bed during thunderstorms, because Ingrid was afraid of lightning, and I would tell her stories until she fell asleep. She moved from Beaufort to our mother Henrietta would be devastated. She loves both of us. This doesn't have to destroy the family and then to the children, which was the sharpest arrow in the quiver, and she knew it. Think about what a public legal battle does to them, she said, to Rafferty, to Esme. Think about what it does to Mom and Dad, to everyone who loves this family. I'm listening, I said. She paused. She had expected interruption or tears or the particular collapse that comes when you press on the right bruise hard enough. My stillness was disrupting her rhythm, and I watched her recalibrate in real time, a slight shift of weight, a small tightening at the corners of her mouth before she continued. She kept going. She talked about the damage of prolonged litigation, about how these things become public record, about how Savannah is a small city with a long and generous memory for scandal. She talked about Rafferty's school, about Corbin standing at Savannah Memorial, about things fraying at edges that couldn't easily be restitched once pulled apart. She talked for approximately 4 minutes without stopping. I let her finish. Then the register changed. Drummond thinks this can be resolved without going to discovery, she said, and the warmth in her voice had dropped several degrees. There are settlement options that would be fair to everyone. Continuing this the way Theodora is planning to continue this, it's going to be painful for all of us. Publicly painful. I appreciate the concern, I said. Something flickered in her face. She hadn't expected that either. Sloan. Her voice was lower now, more direct. The performance was compressing into something harder underneath it, like bone beneath softened muscle. I know things about you. Things you told me over 23 years. The hard things. The things you're not proud of. The fears, the difficult moments. The things that would make certain people see you differently. A pause carefully calibrated. I don't want to use them. I'm not threatening you. I'm asking you to think honestly about whether this fight is worth what it's going to cost everyone involved. 3 seconds. I had learned the 3-second pause in interview training at Quantico. The silence that follows a statement of intent long enough to let the other person hear what they just said, short enough that it doesn't harden into a standoff. 3 seconds of absolute stillness. It works in interrogation rooms and federal depositions. It turns out it works on front porches in Savannah, too. Ingrid heard herself in those 3 seconds. I watched it happen across her face, not guilt exactly, but the particular discomfort of a person who has said a thing aloud and cannot unsay it. What you just described, I said when the count was finished, is witness intimidation in the context of active civil litigation. I'm going to assume you didn't mean to say it out loud, but Theodora will want to hear about it regardless. I tilted my head slightly. She documents everything. Ingrid opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. You should go, I said. The same tone I use to close a meeting when the useful part is over and what remains is only noise. She went. Her back was straight and her stride was even the walk of someone containing considerable rage with the specific discipline of a person who refuses to be seen losing. She didn't look back. The Volvo pulled from the curb smoothly, no hesitation, no drama. She had rehearsed the exit too. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway with my back against it for 1 full minute, and I let myself feel it. Not the anger I had somewhere to put the anger. It had a folder, a case number, and a forensic accountant's carefully organized methodology. What I let myself feel was the grief. 23 years. The thunderstorms in Beaufort. The phone calls at midnight when our father had his first cardiac episode. The way she held Rafferty in the hospital the day he was born, this small, perfect, howling creature, and looked at me over his head with something that had looked completely and convincingly like love. He's perfect, Sloan. He's absolutely perfect. She had meant it in that moment. I still believe that. The truth about what came later didn't erase the years before it. It just changed the weight of everything they'd carried. I gave myself 60 seconds. Then I straightened, walked to the kitchen, and stood at the counter. I texted Theodora Ingrid came tonight, implied threat personal information as leverage. I stayed calm. Please note it. Her reply came in under 2 minutes. Noted and documented. That's mistake number 3. They're scared, Sloan. Scared people make more mistakes. I read the word 3 and held it for a moment. 3 mistakes in 8 days. The threatening email sent from a device registered near Drummond's office. The IP trace that our internal security team had already flagged and filed. And now this, a visit that Theodora could characterize without stretching a single word as intimidation of a party to active civil litigation. Every move they made out of fear was a move I didn't have to make myself. Every mistake was another tab in Theodora's folder. I set the phone face down on the counter and looked out the back window at the garden. The azaleas Rafferty had planted in February were coming into bloom small, stubborn pink against the dark soil. He had chosen the variety himself, consulted a gardening book he'd borrowed from the school library, planted each one with the particular focused patience of a child who understands that some things require waiting. I thought about Ingrid driving back across the bridge right now, replaying the conversation, wondering where she had miscalculated. How many more mistakes I thought before they run out of room entirely. Children absorb the frequencies adults emit, even when the adults believe they aren't emitting anything at all. Rafferty had been quiet for 2 weeks, not withdrawn quiet in the particular way of a 10-year-old who is listening very carefully and waiting for the right moment to speak. It was a Tuesday night in May past 10 o'clock and his light was still on. I stood in the doorway for a moment before he knew I was there. He was sitting on the window seat, knees pulled up, looking out at the back garden. The azaleas he'd planted in February were dark shapes in the dark, and he was watching them the way kids watch things when they're working something out, not really seeing what's in front of them, seeing what's inside. I knocked softly on the open door. He turned. "Hey, bud." He looked at me for a moment with that careful face of his, the one that reminded me sometimes uncomfortably of my own face in the mirror when I was reading a file and something didn't add up. "Mom," he said, "did Dad hurt you?" I sat down on the floor beside the window seat back against the wall the way I used to sit when he was small and asked me to stay until he fell asleep. The hardwood was cool through my jeans. Down the hall, Esme's nightlight glowed faint orange. I didn't lie to him. I also didn't hand a 10-year-old the weight of forensic accounting reports and LLC filings and a second mortgage he couldn't yet understand. "Dad and I are going through something really hard," I said. "Adults sometimes hurt each other in ways that don't leave marks you can see. But you are safe. Esme is safe. This house is safe." I looked at him steadily. "That won't change." He thought about that. Rafferty was not a child who accepted an answer just to have one. He turned it over, checked its underside the way he did with everything. "Is that why you were crying last week?" he asked. I hadn't known he'd seen that. I kept my face even. "Yeah," I said. "That's why." He nodded slowly like he was filing something away. Then, "Is Aunt Ingrid coming back here?" The question landed heavier than I expected. Not because of what it was, but because of what it meant that he had heard something, or seen something, or assembled something from the pieces that adults leave lying around when they think no one is watching. He knew Ingrid had been here. He knew she and I had not embraced on the porch. He had added these things to the other things he'd been quietly adding for 2 weeks. I didn't answer the question directly. I wrapped one arm around his shoulders and held him, and he let me. And for a while we just sat there in the window with the dark garden below us. When I felt his breathing settle, I said, "You don't have to figure this out, Raph. That's my job. Your job is to be 11 in June and terrible at long division." A small sound half laugh, reluctant but real. "I'm not terrible at long division," he said. "You made your teacher cry last week." She was already having a bad day. I pressed my lips together to keep from smiling. "Go to sleep," I said. Esme found me at the breakfast table the next morning, still in her pajamas, hair wild from sleep, entirely unconcerned with the ambient tension that her brother had been quietly metabolizing for 2 weeks. "Mom," she said, climbing onto her chair and reaching for the syrup before her plate had even landed, "how come Dad sleeps at a different house now? 7 years old, direct as a compass needle." "Sometimes grown-ups need their own space to think things through," I said, setting her French toast in front of her. She considered this with the philosophical brevity available only to second graders. "Like how I need the whole bathroom when I'm doing my hair." "Exactly like that." "Okay," she said, and drowned her French toast in maple syrup, and that was the end of it. I stood at the counter and watched her eat and thought children recover along the bottom. They find the floor and stand on it and keep going. My job was to make sure the floor held. I called Theodora at 8:15 after the school run. "I need a clause in the custody agreement," I said without preamble. "Ingrid Calloway is not permitted to be present under any circumstances during Corbin's custodial time. No exceptions, no written consent mechanism, absolute." A beat. "I already drafted it," Theodora said. "I was just waiting for you to ask." I exhaled something that had been sitting in my chest for 3 days. "Thank you. It's clean language. It'll hold." That night, after both children were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and did not open my laptop. I looked at the 2 mugs on the shelf above the coffee maker mine, the cream one, with the chipped handle I'd had since graduate school, and the dark blue one Corbin had brought back from a conference in Baltimore 4 years ago and decided was his. Both still there. I hadn't moved his. I wasn't sure yet what moving it would mean. I let myself cry for approximately 5 minutes. Not for Corbin, not for Ingrid, and not for the money, and not for the version of my life that had turned out to be a construction. I cried because Rafferty had looked at me with those careful eyes and asked, "Did Dad hurt you?" And I had not been able to give him an answer that was both true and simple, and he deserved both. He deserved so much better than a question his mother couldn't answer cleanly. 5 minutes. Then I dried my face and filled a glass of water and stood at the sink. My phone buzzed on the table. Corbin. I picked it up. Something in me steadied and then shifted because the voice that came through wasn't the voice of the man backed into a corner, defending or demanding. It was the other voice, the one I'd known for 10 years before this, the one that used to read to the kids on Sunday mornings and remember how I took my coffee without asking. That voice I thought is more dangerous than all the lawyers in Savannah. I said nothing yet. I let him speak. I had prepared myself for his anger, for Drummond's tactics, for the procedural machinery of a contested divorce grinding against everything I'd spent 9 months building. What I had not prepared for was how precisely he would use it. The call lasted 22 minutes. He didn't lead with demands. He didn't mention Drummond or the filing or the obstruction inquiry that his own attorney had quietly generated. He led with Rafferty. "He's not sleeping," Corbin said. His voice had the texture of genuine worry, and that was the difficulty because I knew that voice had known it for 10 years and could not be entirely certain in this moment whether what I was hearing was performance or the real residue of a man who still loved his son despite everything else he had done. He told me last weekend. He's lying awake. He said he doesn't want to say anything because he doesn't want to make things worse. I pressed my thumb against the edge of my phone case and said nothing for a moment. "I know my children," I said finally. "I know you do." A pause. "That's not what I'm saying." And there it was, the thing that made Corbin's kindness more dangerous than Drummond's motions or Ingrid's tulips. He was not wrong. Rafferty was not sleeping. I had known that since Tuesday night on the window seat, and the knowing sat in my chest like something that hadn't fully dissolved. Whatever Corbin had become in a lawyer's office or a Charleston apartment or a forensic accounting report, he was still the man who coached Rafferty's soccer team on Saturday mornings and knew without asking that Esme needed the nightlight left on even now that she was 7. That was still true. It did not cancel the other things, but it was still true. He moved carefully to the suggestion. "Not reconciliation," he said before I could respond to a proposal he hadn't made yet, and the preemptive denial told me the suggestion had been scripted. "I'm not asking for that. I'm asking if we could sit down, just the two of us, no attorneys, and talk about how to make this less of a war for Raph and Esme. A mediation, maybe. Something quieter." I let the silence run for 2 seconds. "I'll speak to Theodora," I said. Theodora's response came before I'd finished my coffee the next morning. "He's doing it because Drummond told him the forensic report is solid and the federal obstruction exposure is real," she said, with the brisk precision of someone who had already run the calculation before I called. "He's trying to create the appearance of good faith before we get to discovery. Don't mistake strategy for sincerity." "I don't," I said, but I did hesitate. A beat. That's human Sloan. Hesitation isn't the same as surrender. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd talk to you." "Good. That's exactly the right answer." She paused. "Do you want me to respond to Drummond directly, or do you want to be the one to close the door?" "You close it," I said, politely. The tulips arrived on a Thursday. I was at my desk in the Savannah field office working through a wire transfer analysis when the front desk called to say there was a delivery. I went out to the lobby and found them on the reception counter, a large arrangement of yellow tulips the color of early spring, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a white ribbon. Yellow tulips, my favorite since college, a fact I had mentioned to exactly one person in the last 15 years. The card was handwritten. "I miss you." I know I don't have the right to say that. I stood and looked at the arrangement for 30 seconds. Then I lifted it and set it on the reception desk, facing outward, visible to anyone walking through the lobby, to every agent who passed the front desk, to the security camera above the entrance. Then I went back to my desk, noted the delivery time, the florist's address printed on the paper wrap, and the exact wording of the card in the evidence file under Regulatory Updates Q3. Isadora came by 10 minutes later. She stopped at the edge of my cubicle, looked toward the lobby, looked at me. She didn't say a word. She nodded once slowly, the way you nod at someone who has just done something that required more composure than it looked like. I turned back to my wire transfer analysis. The Saturday morning in early June arrived clean and bright. The kind of Savannah morning that smells like cut grass and salt air, and the particular sweetness of Confederate jasmine on old brick walls. I was upstairs in the bedroom working through the closet, not out of distress, just the quiet. Methodical sorting that had started to feel like reclaiming square footage when the doorbell rang at 10. I looked through the window before I went down. Corbin stood on the porch. Ingrid was 2 steps behind and to his left, not quite beside him, not quite separate. The arrangement had the geometry of a rehearsed position. He was in the clothes he wore on weekends. She was in the linen dress again, the gray one, the considered costume. I stood at the window for a moment. Every trained instinct I had said, "Don't open it." You have legal representation. You have a process. You have a folder labeled Exhibit C, and a federal obstruction inquiry and a durable power of attorney misuse that carries criminal exposure. You do not need to open the door. But there was another instinct, older, quieter, that said something different. You've been reading the documents for weeks. Let them speak in person once. Let them show you the whole shape of it. I went downstairs. I put my hand on the door handle. Not weakness, I thought. Not sentiment. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is let people show you exactly who they are one final time. I opened the door. Before I tell you what happened when I opened that door drop, still here in the comments, because what you're about to see is the moment the mask came off completely. Quick note, this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Names, places, and certain details are coincidental, but what it leaves you with is yours to keep. If that's not for you, no pressure. But if you're staying, don't look away. There is something almost theatrical about two people who have rehearsed their entrance. Corbin stood on my porch that Saturday morning in June, Ingrid positioned 2 steps behind and to his left, and I understood immediately that I was watching a performance one they had practiced together. I stepped back and let them in, not because I was uncertain, because I had decided at the top of the stairs 20 minutes earlier that the most useful thing I could do was give them the room they needed to finish becoming who they already were. I had been reading documents for 6 weeks. It was time to let them speak in person once so I could see the whole shape of it. I gestured toward the sofa. I took the armchair, the wingback near the window, the one that puts the morning light behind me and leaves anyone sitting opposite squinting slightly into it. A small advantage. An old habit from 11 years of federal interviews. You control the light, you control the room. They sat together on the sofa close, but not touching the way people sit when they have agreed in advance not to confirm what they are to each other. The careful, practiced distance of 2 people who have rehearsed not only their entrance, but their arrangement. I waited. Corbin opened with Esme. She cried on the way to school last Tuesday, he said. His voice carried the modulated concern of a man who understood how to deploy tenderness with precision, not felt, not performed, exactly, but calibrated. Did you know that? I know my children, I said, and I'm managing this process and their well-being simultaneously. Those 2 things aren't in conflict. I'm not saying they are. The same preemptive deflection I had heard on the phone 2 weeks prior, word for word. Scripted then, both times from the same script. I'm saying there might be a way to do this that's less damaging for everyone. A structured mediation, outside the courtroom, somewhere quieter. Theodora has already responded to Drummond on that point, I said, through the appropriate channels. A beat. His jaw shifted slightly, a micro-expression, the kind that lasts less than a second, the face of a man whose prepared text has just been skipped ahead by someone who read it before he arrived. He recovered quickly. He was good at recovering. Ingrid leaned forward. Slow. Don't. 1 word. No elaboration, no explanation, no softening. She heard it and sat back against the cushions. She tried a different angle. Her voice dropped into the register. I recognized immediately the confiding tone, the one she had used since we were teenagers when she needed something from someone and wanted them to feel chosen for the knowing. The voice that had worked on me reliably for 23 years. I'm not here for him, she said. A small gesture toward Corbin, dismissive and intimate, at the same time the gesture of a woman who has learned that suggesting distance from a man is its own form of closeness. I want you to know what Drummond is actually planning, the deposition strategy. There's a line of questioning about your FBI caseload, the Meridian audit. I don't think it's right. I thought you deserved to hear it from me. I looked at her steadily. He's planning to argue that inconsistencies in the Meridian report establish a pattern of professional negligence that creates reasonable doubt about the reliability of my forensic analysis in this proceeding, I said. He'll file the motion within the next 30 days, likely paired with a request for an independent financial review. It won't succeed because the Meridian audit was peer-reviewed and filed clean in November of 2022, which Drummond already knows, which is precisely why it's a delay tactic rather than a substantive argument. I paused. Was there something in that you thought I hadn't already worked out? Ingrid was quiet for 2 full seconds. Then her face changed. Not the way faces change when emotion builds gradually, not that slow tide. It changed the way a door closes, quickly, completely, and with finality. The performance dropped away, and what was underneath it was older than anything I'd seen from her before and considerably less careful. You always have to be the smartest person in the room, don't you? Not a question. a verdict she had apparently been saving for some time. Even now, even after everything, you cannot let anything simply be what it is without turning it into something you've already won. I held her gaze without changing my expression. "You had a 2-year affair with my husband," I said. My voice was the voice I use for depositions level factual without editorial weight. "You helped him transfer $500,000 out of our joint accounts through a company registered in your name. You used a power of attorney he obtained through my trust to place a mortgage on this house without my knowledge or signature." I let the silence hold for a moment. Forgive me for treating it like a war. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something entirely true has been said in front of people who were not prepared to absorb it. Corbin reached over and placed his hand on top of Ingrid's. She pulled hers away. 3 inches, maybe less. A small involuntary withdrawal, the body doing what the mind hadn't quite decided yet. He looked at his own hand for a fraction of a second before his expression recovered. But I had spent 11 years reading the space between people, and what I saw in those 3 inches was exactly what Theodora had told me 3 weeks ago. Sitting across from me at the Jones Street table, scared people make more mistakes. They were beginning to make them with each other. "I'd like both of you to leave now," I said. I stood, which ended the conversation the way standing always ends conversations, not dramatically, just finally. Your attorneys know how to reach mine. Neither of them spoke. Corbin got to his feet, first composed, still maintaining the performance of the reasonable man who had tried his best, and moved toward the hallway. Ingrid followed. The distance between them as they walked to the front door was wider than it had been when they sat down. I stood in the open doorway and watched them cross the porch. At the front path, Ingrid said something low, not meant for me, but I caught the register, if not the words. Cold, pointed, accusatory. Corbin answered in 3 syllables, flat and clipped. The passenger door of his car closed harder than it needed to. I shut the front door. I pressed my forehead against the cool painted wood and stood there for 3 seconds, just 3, letting the particular silence of an empty house settle around me like water finding its level. The door had been here since 1923. It had held a long time. It would hold a little longer. Then I straightened, walked down the hall, and went into the home office. The evidence folders were where I had left them tabbed and ordered on the desk. I had been through them more times than I could count over the past 6 weeks, but the night before. Working late through the insurance documents, the ones I had always deferred to Corbin because he was the physician, and I had trusted him to manage the medical and life portfolios, I had found something, a number, in a specific context, at a specific date. I had looked at it for a long time before I closed the file and went to bed. It had followed me through the night the way certain numbers do when they refuse to reconcile against any innocent explanation. Some numbers, when you encounter them in the right context, stop being numbers. They become questions. And this particular question had only one answer that made any coherent sense. I was not ready to say it out loud, but I was going to call Theodora first thing Monday morning. Theodora called the morning after they left. She had found the insurance policy review in the forensic file. She didn't say much on the phone. She just said, "I need you to drive to the Outer Banks this weekend. Take Saoirse up on her invitation. You need 4 days away from that house, and I need you thinking clearly when you come back." I left Savannah on a Friday morning before the city woke up. I-95 North out of Georgia runs through the flat coastal plain of South Carolina, marsh grass and pine stands, and the occasional water tower belonging to a town you've never heard of. 4 hours of highway with nothing to do but drive and think, which is either the best or worst thing you can prescribe for a woman in the middle of a federal divorce proceeding, depending on the woman. It was the first time I had been genuinely alone since April. Not the surface alone of an empty house, the kind where your children's drawings are still on the refrigerator, and your husband's coffee mug is still on the shelf, and the silence is full of other people's presence. This was road alone, moving alone. The particular freedom of a woman in a car going somewhere with intention, with no one watching the door. I let myself have it for exactly 4 hours. Theodora called when I pulled into Saoirse's driveway. The house was a weathered cedar shake rental 2 blocks from the beach. Saoirse had been coming here every June for 8 years, ever since her divorce. And she'd started inviting me 3 years ago when she said I looked like a woman who needed to remember what the ocean smelled like. She'd been right each time. I sat in the parked car and answered. Theodora's voice was the same as it always was, even deliberate, the voice of someone who had learned that composure in difficult conversations is a professional courtesy. She told me what she'd found in the forensic audit, and she told it the way she told everything in the order it mattered. In October 2023, Corbin had initiated a policy review on my life insurance. The existing policy, a standard term policy we'd held jointly since year 3 of our marriage, had been modified. The benefit amount had been doubled, $2 million. The modification had been processed in the second week of October 2023. Callaway Design Partners, LLC, had been registered in Delaware in February of 2023. The second mortgage on the Ardsley Park house had been signed on October 31, 2023. 3 documents, 1 month. "I'm not rushing to conclusions," Theodora said, "but I need you to know this." There was a silence on the line. We both sat in it. The question that neither of us said out loud was the one that had followed me through the previous night, the one I'd looked at in the insurance file, and then closed before bed, hoping sleep would make it smaller. It hadn't. "In isolation, it's not enough for a criminal charge," Theodora said. "But in a deposition alongside everything else, the LLC, the POA, the Austin lease, the obstruction attempt, it changes the atmosphere in the room. It changes what the jury imagines," I said. "Yes," she said. "It does." I thanked her and sat in the driveway for another minute after the call ended, watching a pelican cross the sky above the roofline. Unhurried. Indifferent to everything below. October 2023, I thought. He was already building the exit in October. That evening, Saoirse and I sat on the porch with wine and the sound of the Atlantic in the dark. The Outer Banks at night in June has a particular quality. The wind off the water is warm but insistent, the kind that makes conversation feel more honest than it would indoors. Saoirse had been quieter than usual since I arrived, which I had noticed and filed away. She refilled my glass without being asked. Then she set the bottle down and looked at the water. "Sloane," she said, "I need to tell you something. 8 months ago, I ran into them at a restaurant in Charleston, Corbin and Ingrid, together." I turned to look at her. I didn't say anything. I had learned over 11 years of federal interviews that the most important thing you can do after someone begins a confession is simply wait. I told myself I wasn't sure what I'd seen, she said. "They were just having dinner. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself you were happy." She turned her wine glass once in her hand, and then 3 days later, Ingrid called me. She described it carefully, the way people describe things they've replayed many times. Ingrid hadn't threatened her. Nothing as direct as that. She had been warm, interested, solicitous, the version of Ingrid that felt like sunlight, until you noticed where the shadows fell. She had mentioned a design contract, a significant one, the kind of commercial project that would have meant 6 months of guaranteed work for Saoirse's studio. And in the middle of the conversation framed as friendly concern, "I'm sure you know how complicated things can get. Sloane has always been the strong one. She doesn't need people adding to her worries with things they're not even sure about." She didn't have to say it plainly, Saoirse said. She was good enough that she didn't need to. "Did you take the contract?" "No." A pause. But I stayed quiet. I convinced myself that was the same as protecting you. She looked at me directly then, and her eyes were doing the thing that eyes do when someone is about to say a thing they've needed to say for a long time. "I was scared, Sloane." And Ingrid knew exactly how to use that. I stood up. I walked to the porch railing and held it with both hands and looked out at the water. 8 months, Saoirse. Not anger, I noticed the absence of it actually, which surprised me. What I felt was the specific gravity of the number. 8 months during which I had been living in a house with a man who was planning to leave it, during which I had been standing next to Ingrid at Thanksgiving and believing the warmth was real, during which the exit had been structured and funded and given a zip code. 8 months during which my closest friend had known something was wrong and had found a way to explain it into silence. Behind me, Saoirse said nothing. I heard her set her glass down on the wooden rail. We stood there for a while with the Atlantic between us and everything else. The ocean didn't care what people did to each other on shore. It just kept moving. We drank our coffee in the morning on the same porch, watching the sun come up over the water in the long, flat way it does on the Outer Banks. Not dramatic, just relentless. The light arriving whether you were ready for it or not. We didn't talk about the night before. There wasn't a way to talk about it yet that would be useful. But before I loaded my bag into the car to drive back to Savannah, I stood on the driveway with my phone in my hand. My parents had been married 41 years. My father had served 30 years on the bench in Georgia, and he believed without exception that people were owed the truth in direct proportion to how much they loved you. I had been putting this call off for 6 weeks. You owe them the truth, I thought, and you owe yourself the testimony of people who have known you your whole life. I pressed dial. My parents built their life in Savannah the way they built everything carefully, deliberately, and with the expectation that the people they loved would do the same. Telling them the truth was the hardest conversation of that entire year. Not because they wouldn't believe me, because they would. I drove to their house on Abercorn Street the evening I returned from the Outer Banks. The house where I grew up is a late Victorian on the south end of the historic district, not grand but solid. The kind of house that has absorbed 60 years of a family's particular habits and started to smell like them. My mother's garden in the side yard. My father's books visible through the study window from the street. The porch light always on after dark, which had been true since my sister and I were teenagers and had never stopped being true. I sat in the driveway for 2 minutes before I went inside. My mother had made tea the way she always does when she senses something is coming. We sat in the front parlor, the room where I'd done homework and argued about curfews, and watched my parents grow incrementally older while believing the way children do, that they would simply continue, and I told them everything. I started at the beginning. Corbin's confession on the Wednesday night in April. Ingrid. 2 years. The Charles Schwab account and the $340,000 transferred through Callaway Design, Partners LLCI, watched my mother's face change when she heard the name. Registered that she understood immediately whose name it was. The durable power of attorney. The second mortgage, the Austin lease with Ingrid Callaway listed as co-tenant. I did not soften it. They were not people who needed softening. My mother cried before I finished. Not the quiet tears of someone being careful, the crying of a woman whose internal architecture is being reorganized in real time. She pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the window and then back at me. And what was in her face was not pity for me. It was something older and more complicated. "How long has it been since I really saw her?" she said. Not to me, to the room. My father said nothing. He sat in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who has spent 30 years on the bench listening to the worst things people do to each other and has learned that the first response to something true and terrible is simply to receive it. His face gave nothing away. His hands were still on the arms of the chair. When I finished, he stood up. He picked up his phone from the side table. "Ingrid," he said when she answered, and his voice was not the voice he used at Sunday dinner or at Christmas or at Rafferty's birthday parties. It was the other voice, the one I had heard exactly once before when I was 17 and had lied to him about where I'd been and which I had never forgotten. "Come home this week. We need to speak in person." She arrived on a Tuesday. I was not there for it. My father had asked me not to be, which I understood as both protection and strategy. He called me that evening and told me what had happened, and I have reconstructed the scene from his account and from what I know of Ingrid's particular playbook. She had come in the soft version. The version that leads with remorse and pivots quickly to context. It was complicated. It happened gradually. Corbin pursued it. These things aren't simple. The version that has worked in one form or another, since she was 9 years old and could talk her way out of anything by making the adult feel like the situation was too nuanced for simple judgment. My father had let her finish. Then he said, "I don't care who started it." He paused, and I can hear it even secondhand. The particular weight of a pause from a man who has timed pauses for 30 years. And then, I care that he sat at this table every Thanksgiving for 10 years. I care that he was holding Rafferty the day that boy was born in this family's presence as part of this family. I care that you knew for 2 years, and you kept coming back here. You let us love you while you were doing it. My mother had been quiet through all of it. She stood when Ingrid started to answer. In 58 years of knowing my mother, I had seen her angry twice. This was something different. This was the particular cold clarity that comes after grief has finished, and what remains is simply fact. You need to leave this house, Ingrid, she said, until you understand what you did, not what happened to you, not the circumstances, what you did. You need to go. Ingrid left. My father told me she didn't argue. He said she looked, for the first time he could remember, genuinely frightened, not of consequence, not of exposure, but of the specific loss of being known by people who have known you your whole life and choosing deliberately to become a stranger to them. He called me that evening at 9. His voice was older than it had been that morning. Grief does that, compresses years into hours when it arrives late and lands on a man who thought he had already seen everything. Whatever you need from us, he said, legal, financial, whatever it costs, we are here. I held the phone for a long time after we hung up. The house was quiet. The children were asleep. Weston was at the foot of the bed, and outside the jasmine was doing what it always did in June in Savannah, which is to say it was extravagant and indifferent and entirely itself. Whatever it costs, I thought. We are here. I had not known until that moment how much I had needed to hear it. Later that night, Saoirse sent me a screenshot. Ingrid had posted something on her social media, 3 sentences, no names. The careful language of someone who understood that vagueness was its own form of accusation. It was enough. Anyone who moved in the overlapping circles of both our lives and in Savannah, those circles were wide and old and thoroughly interconnected, would understand exactly what it referenced. I looked at it for a moment. Savannah has a long memory. It is a city of old families and older loyalties where the same surnames appear on park benches and courthouse plaques and church directories, where people remember what your father stood for because they watched him stand for it for 3 decades. My father, Theodore Calloway, who had served 30 years on the bench in this city, had not needed to say a word. Ingrid had just started a narrative war in his town. In every story of betrayal, there is always someone who watched it happen from the inside, someone with every reason to speak and every reason to stay silent. History tends to forget them. But sometimes, when the moment is right, they remember themselves. Theodora called at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. She was a woman who scheduled everything. "Come to the office," she said. "There's someone you need to meet." She didn't explain further. In 9 weeks of working together, I had learned that Theodora Vance said exactly what was required, and nothing additional, which meant that when she left something out, the omission was intentional. I was there by 9:30. The woman sitting in Theodora's conference room was in her mid-50s, with the particular composure of someone who has made a decision and arrived already at peace with it. She wore her Savannah Memorial Hospital badge on a lanyard tucked under her lapel, not displayed, not hidden, just present. She had a file folder on the table in front of her, thick and tabbed. "This is Winifred Oakes," Theodora said. "Senior medical assistant at Savannah Memorial, 12 years. Winifred looked at me with steady eyes. "I want to tell you what I know," she said. "And then I want to give you what I brought." I sat down across from her. "I'm listening." She had worked in Corbin's department for 7 of those 12 years. In that time, he had passed her over for a senior coordinator position 3 times once, with an explanation twice without. He had questioned her documentation in front of colleagues in the specific way designed to diminish rather than correct. He had described her to her supervisor as resistant to feedback, the precise language used in hospital culture to sideline someone without formal cause. She had not filed a complaint. She had documented instead. I knew about the calls, she said. Corbin used the hospital's internal VoIP system to contact your sister, rather than his personal phone. Staff phones are locked in lockers during procedures, but the internal system stays accessible at the nursing station. He used it regularly. She paused, then explained before I could ask. Every call made from a hospital extension to an outside number is automatically logged by the VoIP system. It's a federal compliance requirement under Joint Commission standards. The hospital cannot disable it, and no individual physician can override it. The logs are maintained in the administrative database for a minimum of 7 years. She looked at me evenly. As a senior coordinator in the department, I have legitimate access to communication records within my administrative scope. I've known where to look for a long time. I was waiting until I had enough to be useful. She slid the first section across the table. 43 contacts over 14 months. Corbin's hospital extension to Ingrid's mobile number. Dates times duration logged with the clean indifference of a system that records everything and cares about nothing. The hotel bookings came through the hospital's corporate travel account, she continued. Physicians with administrative privileges use it for conference reservations. As department coordinator, I have visibility into the scheduling system. He used the account 4 times for personal bookings, Charleston twice, Hilton Head twice. The receipts are in the second tab. The last section of the folder was a legal document, a civil complaint filed in Wake County, North Carolina in March of 2019. Plaintiff, Gerald Forsyth. Defendant, Ingrid M. Calloway. Cause of action, alienation of affection. Judgment for the plaintiff. I looked at the photograph attached to the exhibit. Ingrid in a different haircut, a different city, the same composed expression she wore when she was calculating her next position. Another family. Another set of people who had believed she was one of them. This is the 4th time, Winifred said, that I know of. The room was quiet. Why are you doing this? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Because someone should have done it sooner, she said, and because I am tired of pretending I didn't see what I saw. It was not a complicated answer. In its plainness, it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. Theodora organized the materials with methodical efficiency. Georgia abolished alienation of affection in 1979, she said without looking up. You can't bring that claim here. South Carolina abolished it in 1992 as well, so that avenue is closed on both ends. She set down her pen. But the North Carolina judgment is fully admissible as character evidence in your proceeding. North Carolina still recognizes the tort, and the 2019 ruling establishes a documented pattern of conduct across multiple relationships and jurisdictions. In a deposition pattern matters enormously. After settlement, could I pursue a separate civil claim against Ingrid through North Carolina, potentially given the documented conduct, but it would extend the litigation by years. She looked up. It would be your choice. I thought about it for a moment. No, I said. Theodora waited. I want the settlement, the house, the custody terms, the restitution. I want Rafferty and Esme to have a mother who is finished with this in a year, not 3. I paused. Ingrid will construct her own consequences. People like her always do. Theodora held my gaze, then nodded once and returned to the folders. Meanwhile, the city was doing what Savannah does. A colleague at Savannah Memorial had quietly removed Corbin from a hospital community panel. 2 families in Ardsley Park had stopped returning his calls. My father had said nothing publicly he hadn't needed to. 30 years of standing in a community means that silence deployed correctly is louder than most people's words. Theodora closed the last folder. We have everything we need, she said. Deposition is scheduled for Wednesday the 3rd. 1 week. 1 week. I drove home through the squares of the historic district live oaks overhead in the late afternoon light and thought about the photograph in the SC filing the composed expression. The calculation behind it, the family before ours. Ingrid still had 1 move left. I didn't know what it would be, but I had spent 11 years following money through the decisions people make when they're cornered, and I knew one thing with certainty. When someone is panicking, they don't reach for their best idea. They reach for the nearest one. 4 days before the deposition, Ingrid played what I can only describe as her final card. It was not a clever move, it was a desperate one. And in my experience, the difference between those two things is everything. The notification came through Theodora's office on a Friday afternoon. Drummond Hayes had filed a formal motion Ingrid Calloway was 7 weeks pregnant. She was asserting that Corbin Whitfield was the father. On that basis, Drummond was requesting a postponement of the deposition scheduled for Wednesday the 3rd and a full reassessment of the settlement terms to account for potential parental rights and financial obligations. Theodora called me at 4:15 and read it to me in full in the same even voice she used to read everything. I sat with it for a moment. That, I said, is what someone does when they've run out of real options. Yes, Theodora said. It is, Corbin called 20 minutes later. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, not the rehearsed calm of the man who had delivered his confession on a Wednesday night in April. Not the careful reasonableness of the man who had suggested mediation over the phone in May. This was something raw, unscripted. I didn't know she was going to do this, he said. I believed him, which made it more interesting, not less. Talk to your attorney, Corbin, I said, and ended the call. Theodora did not argue the motion. She countered it. Within 48 hours, she had filed a request for a court-ordered prenatal paternity test, cell-free fetal DNA analysis, clinically reliable from 9 to 10 weeks of gestation. At 7 weeks, the court could schedule testing within 2 weeks without prejudicing the proceeding in any meaningful way. Her filing was precise. The pregnancy claim had been introduced into active divorce proceedings involving disputed marital assets and pending custody determinations. Under Georgia family law, when paternity becomes a material question in such proceedings, the court has authority to order testing. She cited the statute. She cited the case law. She attached Drummond's own motion as Exhibit A. Ingrid's response came 4 days later through Drummond health concerns during early pregnancy. Stress risk, privacy rights, medical discretion. It was the legal equivalent of a person who was tripped on their own shoelace, explaining at length why they had not actually fallen. The court reviewed the competing motions and issued its ruling 10 days after Theodora's filing. The objections were denied. The test was ordered. The lab appointment was scheduled. Ingrid had no remaining options except to comply. The results came back on a Thursday morning. Theodora called me at the office. I stepped into the small conference room off the main bullpen, the one with the frosted glass door that signals to the rest of the floor that a conversation is private, and I closed the door and sat down. She read the finding in one sentence. The child was not Corbin Whitfield's. I held the phone and looked at the frosted glass and thought about the geometry of what Ingrid had constructed the 2-year affair, the LLC, the mortgage, the Austin lease. The pregnancy announcement deployed 4 days before a deposition like a last grenade, and how each piece of it had been designed to create leverage, and how each piece of it had instead become evidence. She handed us everything, Theodora said. Whatever credibility Drummond had left walking into that deposition room, it's gone. His client introduced a fraudulent paternity claim into active legal proceedings. That is not a recoverable position. What does Corbin know? I asked. Drummond told him this morning. I'm told the conversation was difficult. I thought about Corbin receiving that piece of information that the woman for whom he had transferred $340,000 forged a second mortgage, planned an escape to Austin, and blown apart a 10-year marriage, had been at some point during their 2-year affair also sleeping with someone else. I thought about what that knowledge does to a person's understanding of the story they thought they were living. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt something quieter, the particular stillness that comes when a long calculation finally resolves. In Charleston, Ingrid's design studio lost 2 more commercial contracts that month. I did not track how the information spread. Information in a city like Savannah, connected by decades of overlapping families and professional networks, does not need a sender. It moves on its own once it starts moving. At Savannah Memorial, Corbin's colleagues had not said anything directly. They didn't need to. 30 years in federal law enforcement had taught me that the most effective form of social consequence is the meeting you don't get invited to the hallway conversation that stops when you walk in, the committee slot that quietly goes to someone else. Corbin was still employed. He was simply no longer trusted. The rescheduled deposition was set for a Wednesday in early July. The morning it arrived, I stood in front of my closet for longer than usual. I had bought the suit in May navy wool blend, single button, the kind of thing I wore for federal testimony, and I had hung it on the right side of the closet, separate from my regular work clothes waiting. I put it on now and stood in front of the mirror, not for performance, not to project anything to anyone in that room. Clothing at its most functional is a form of self-possession, the decision to inhabit your own body deliberately, to arrive as yourself rather than as whatever the circumstances are trying to make you. I needed everything I had that morning, and this was one of the things I had. I looked at my own reflection for a moment. 10 years of a marriage were going to be laid out in a conference room on the 12th floor of a building on Bull Street that morning. Every transfer, every document, every logged phone call, every hotel receipt, every clause of a durable power of attorney used without authorization. I had prepared for this. I had been preparing in one form or another since the Wednesday night in April, when Corbin sat in the wrong chair. I was ready, I thought, straightening my lapel. I had been ready for weeks. I just hadn't recognized it until now. I picked up my keys and walked downstairs. I arrived first. I always arrive first. My father taught me that long before he became a judge, and I became his daughter who would one day need the lesson. The person who controls the room controls the conversation. I sat at the conference table on the 12th floor of a building on Bull Street and looked out over Savannah while I waited. The room was quiet in the way conference rooms are quiet when they are waiting to become something else. A court reporter sat at the near end of the table, her equipment already set up, her expression professionally neutral. A pitcher of water, legal pads at each seat. The particular stillness of a space that has been arranged for a confrontation. Through the window, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist was visible 2 blocks east, its twin spires, gray-white against the July sky, patient and unchanging in the way that very old things are patient. I had driven past that cathedral for 9 years on my way to work. This morning, I looked at it differently. I opened my folder and reviewed my notes one final time. I didn't need to. I had been ready for weeks. Corbin and Drummond arrived at 9:12. I watched Corbin's eyes go to Theodora's materials the moment he walked in the organized stack of tabbed folders, color-coded substantial. The kind of documentation that communicates before a single page has been turned. Something shifted in his face. Not the panic of a man surprised, but the recognition of a man who has just understood fully and finally the dimensions of what is standing across from him. Drummond, to his credit, showed nothing. He set his own briefcase on the table, arranged his materials with practiced efficiency, and opened with the composure of a former federal prosecutor who has walked into difficult rooms before. He argued implied consent that Sloan's long-term delegation of financial management to Corbin constituted a de facto authorization of the account activity in question. The language was careful. The framing was clean. He had constructed the best available argument from the available materials, and I gave him the professional acknowledgement of listening to it completely without interrupting. Then Theodora opened the first folder. She worked through the tabs without hurry. That was the choice. Deliberate, unhurried each item placed on the table, with the quiet confidence of someone who is not performing urgency, because she doesn't need to. Tab 1. Charles Schwab. Account statements, 18 months. Every transfer documented, dated, and traced. $340,000 accounted for to the dollar. Tab 2. Callaway Design Partners, LLC. Certificate of Formation, Delaware, February 2023. Operating account records showing the direct flow from the marital brokerage. Ingrid M., Callaway sole member. Tab 3. The second mortgage. $180,000 executed October 31, 2023, against a jointly held property requiring dual signatures. The durable power of attorney signed in good faith in 2020, used without notice or disclosure. Under Georgia Code, Section 16-8-4, the unauthorized conversion of property lawfully held under a power of attorney constitutes theft by conversion, a felony in Georgia, when the value exceeds $24,999. At $180,000, this transaction meets that threshold by a significant margin. The document itself was Exhibit A, Tab 4, the Austin lease. 2-bedroom apartment, Rainy Street, Austin, Texas. Executed December 2023. Tenants Corbin Whitfield and Ingrid Calloway. Start date March 2024. Tab 5, Winifred Oakes's file. 43 contacts between Corbin's hospital extension and Ingrid Calloway's mobile number over 14 months, logged by Savannah Memorial's Federal Compliance VoIP system. 4 personal hotel reservations, Charleston twice. Hilton Head twice processed through the hospital's corporate travel account. Tab 6, Wake County Superior Court, Raleigh, North Carolina, 2019. Forsyth versus Calloway. Alienation of affection, a tort still recognized under North Carolina law. Judgment for plaintiff. Defendant Ingrid M. Calloway. Character evidence establishing a documented pattern of conduct across multiple relationships and jurisdictions. Tab 7, Life Insurance Policy Modification. Benefit amount doubled to $2 million. Processing date second week of October 2023. Noted in the same forensic review, Calloway Design Partners, LLC, registered September 19, 2023. Second mortgage executed October 31, 2023. 3 documents. 1 month. Tab 8, FBI Savannah Field Office, Internal Security Report Case, reference number on file. Threatening communication sent to a federal officer during active civil proceedings. IP trace executed under federal search warrant. Origin Administrative Network device registered to Drummond Hayes & Associates, 104 East Liberty Street, Savannah, Georgia. Potential charge obstruction of justice federal statute. Theodora placed the last folder on the table and folded her hands. Drummond asked for a recess. Through the glass partition, I watched them in the hallway. Drummond spoke quickly, his gestures controlled and precise, the body language of a man managing a situation he did not create, but now owns. Corbin stood with his arms crossed, eyes on the floor, the posture of a man whose internal architecture is being restructured in real time. They came back in after 7 minutes. Corbin looked at me directly, not at Theodora. "This is what you wanted," he said. His voice was quiet with the particular emptiness of a man who has run out of constructed emotion and arrived at something more elemental. "You wanted a reason to burn everything down." I looked at him for a moment. "You gave me every reason," I said. "I simply used them." The court reporter's fingers moved across her keys. Drummond sat down. "We're prepared to discuss settlement," he said. The silence that followed was the good kind, the kind that means something is ended and something else is about to be decided. The court reporter typed the last exchange. Theodora leaned toward me slightly, her voice low. "He's going to give us everything." I looked out the window at the cathedral spires, still patient, still gray-white against the July sky. I thought about the wraparound porch on Ardsley Park, the azalea beds Rafferty had planted in February mud, Esme at breakfast reaching for the syrup before her plate had landed. "Yes," I said, "he will." Settlement negotiations began that afternoon. Drummond opened with a position. I listened, took notes, did not react. Theodora responded. The room moved the way rooms move when one side has documentation and the other side has exposure carefully and in one direction. There was one term: I would not surrender. Not the house, though I would keep it. Not the retirement accounts, though I would receive half. Not the restitution figure, though $520,000 was non-negotiable, and we both knew it. The term that mattered most involved the 2 youngest people in this story. Whatever Drummond offered, whatever concession he framed as reasonable, that clause was not moving. Some things are not about winning. They are about what you build after. Settlement negotiations are not dramatic. They are conducted methodically, slowly, in the language of terms and subclauses rather than human emotion, in a way that is exactly as it should be. I had spent all of my emotion getting to that table. What I wanted now was the law, and this time, the law was entirely on my side. There were 2 sessions. Theodora presented our position in the first clearly, completely, without theater. In the second, Drummond made his concessions in the order that men make concessions when they understand that the alternative is worse. The Victorian house on Ardsley Park Sloane keeps it title transferred in full no buyout. $520,000 full restitution from Corbin's personal accounts to be completed within 60 days of signing. Filed under Georgia Code, Section 19-5-13, Equitable Distribution Adjusted for Documented Marital Waste, comprising $340,000 in fraudulent transfers and $180,000 in unauthorized mortgage, proceeds each item itemized and verified. Non-negotiable. Primary physical custody of Rafferty and Esme Sloane. Corbin alternating weekends and 1 weeknight. Supervised transition exchanges at a neutral location for the first 90 days. The durable power of attorney revoked immediately permanently with written acknowledgement filed with the court. And the final clause, the one I had carried since the night Rafferty sat on the stairs and asked a question I couldn't answer simply. Ingrid Calloway was not permitted to be present under any circumstances during Corbin's custodial time. No exceptions. No provision for written consent. Absolute. Drummond objected. I looked at him across the table. That clause stays, I said, or we take the federal obstruction charge, the power of attorney criminal exposure, and the complete forensic report to trial. I paused. Your firm's network device is in tab 8. I imagine your malpractice carrier would find that interesting. Drummond was quiet for a moment. Then he initialed the clause. I signed the agreement on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July. Theodora held out the pen, the lacquered black one with the gold nib, the same one I had used to sign the petition 11 weeks earlier. To complete, she said. Not to end. To complete. I signed my name in 4 places, the same signature each time. When I set the pen down, the room was quiet in the specific way of things that have been resolved. The aftermath came in stages the way real things always do. In August, Savannah Memorial Hospital opened an internal ethics investigation into Corbin's conduct. Winifred Oakes' documentation, the communication logs, the hotel bookings, the 7 years of careful record-keeping from a woman who had known where to look and waited for the right moment formed the evidentiary foundation. Corbin was placed on administrative suspension pending review. He did not return to the surgical roster. In September, I packed the Victorian house with Rafferty and Esme and Weston and drove 30 minutes south on Highway 278 to Bluffton, South Carolina. The new house sat on a quiet street off Oyster Factory Road backing onto Broad Creek. It was smaller than Ardsley Park, 3 bedrooms, a screened porch, a yard that needed work. Rafferty walked through every room twice before choosing the one with the large window facing the water. He stood at it for a long moment without saying anything, which meant he had made his decision. Esme chose her room in 45 seconds and immediately asked if she could paint it green. I said yes. She selected the exact shade from 17 paint samples with the focused certainty of a 7-year-old who has known what she wanted since before she could articulate it. We painted it on a Saturday in late September. My mother brought lunch. My father carried boxes without being asked. We did not talk about the year. We talked about what the creek would look like in winter and whether Rafferty's new school had a soccer team, and whether Esme's green was more sage or more emerald. She was emphatic that it was neither, that it was simply the correct green, and that we were all looking at it wrong. It was the best afternoon I had had in years. In November, my supervisor called me into her office. Susan Marsh had overseen my unit for 6 years, methodical, fair. The kind of leader who notices what people do under pressure and files it away without comment until the moment comment is required. I've been watching how you've handled this year, she said. It confirmed everything I believed about how you work under pressure. She slid a letter across the desk. Senior Forensic Analyst, effective the 1st of December. Thank you, I said. She nodded once and returned to her files. I walked back to my desk and sat down and looked at the letter for a moment before I put it in my bag. I had earned that title over 9 years of work. The year had not given it to me, But the year had shown me, and apparently Susan, exactly what I was made of when everything else was stripped away. In March of 2025, an anonymous report was filed with the Georgia Composite Medical Board. It was detailed, specific. It cited incidents, dates, and institutional failures with the particular precision of someone who had been present for the events described. The IP address, when traced, resolved to a location in Charleston, South Carolina. Corbin's medical license was revoked permanently. The board's ruling cited a documented pattern of ethical violations and the unauthorized misuse of administrative privileges. No one in this story was surprised by the origin of the report. The person who had helped him build the exit had, when the money ran out and the plan collapsed and the consequences began to land, decided that the wreckage was entirely his fault. People like Ingrid always do eventually. They are very good at leaving. They are less good at standing in what they've left behind. It was a Thursday afternoon in late March when I sat on the screened porch and watched Rafferty and Esme argue about the color of Broad Creek. He said blue. She said green. The water as it happened was neither. It was that particular shade of coastal South Carolina tidal water that shifts between the two depending on the light and the time of day and what the marsh grass is doing at the edges. I heard his footsteps on the porch stairs before I saw him. Mom Rafferty said, slightly out of breath, with the urgency of a child who has decided this is important. Esme says the water looks green today, but I say it looks blue. You decide. I looked out at Broad Creek for a moment. I said, it looks like our water. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. Then he ran back down the steps to report my verdict to his sister. I drank my coffee and watched the light move on the water and thought about the woman I had been on a Wednesday night in April 11 months ago, sitting in Theodora's kitchen at 1 in the cold morning with a notepad and a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and the woman I was now. The house was mine. The money had been returned. The children were safe and arguing about colors in the yard. But the real distance, the distance between that kitchen table and this porch, between the woman whose hand shook and the woman who held the pen steady, that was what had actually been won. Not the settlement, not the title, not the outcome of any of it, the distance. My life was quiet and mine and real, and that I had learned was everything. People ask me sometimes what I learned from all of this. I learned that family betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. It comes from the people who know exactly where you keep your trust and choose to take it anyway. I learned that God doesn't remove the storm. He teaches you to stand in it until it passes. And when it passes, you realize you were stronger than the rain the whole time. I learned too late and the hard way that love without documentation is just a feeling. And feelings, unlike forensic reports, don't hold up in court. So here is my advice. Don't be like me. Don't wait 14 months to look at your own accounts. Don't assume that family betrayal wears a stranger's face. Don't confuse someone's silence for loyalty. Don't ever sign a power of attorney without an expiration date. Family revenge is not something I planned. It was something that arrived on its own, quietly, methodically, the way justice tends to arrive when you stop chasing it and start documenting instead. People imagine family revenge as something loud and deliberate. It isn't. The most powerful thing I ever did was nothing dramatic. It was simply refusing to look away from what was true. What I discovered is that real family revenge doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a Thursday afternoon on a screened porch, watching your children argue about the color of the water, knowing the house is yours, the accounts are settled, and the people who tried to erase you are living inside the consequences they built themselves. That is what winning actually looks like. And if this story taught me one final thing about family betrayal, it's this. Your intelligence is not arrogance. Use it. Your calm is not weakness. Keep it. If any part of this resonated, if you've faced your own family betrayal or found your own quiet way through, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs it tonight. And if you want to be here when the next story begins, subscribe. It's already waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. One final note, some of the stories ahead contain fictional elements constructed for educational and narrative purposes. If that's not the content for you, no judgment, choose what serves you best. But if you're staying, I'm genuinely glad you're here.
Thanks for your time today. I'll see you again in the next story.